Well, hello and welcome to the stream. Let's go ahead and see what we can get into. We're going to do a little bit of Nick Redfern. This is the Men in Black on Coast to Coast AM 622 of 2011.
Black visiting people after apparent UFO cases. It's been going on for a long time. Well, in a moment, we'll check in with Nick Redfern as we talk about his work, his research, the real Men in Black. And welcome back to Coast, British ufologist and cryptozoologist Nick Redfern, author of many books on UFOs, cryptozoology, the paranormal, conspiracy theories. Nick writes regularly for UFO Magazine, Fate Magazine, and others, and has indeed uncovered thousands of pages of previously classified Royal Air Force, Air Ministry, and Ministry of Defense files on UFOs. His latest work, The Real Men in Black. Here he is, back on Coast to Coast, Nick Redfern. Nick, how are you?
Hey, George, I'm doing good, thanks. How's it going?
Good. All is well these days. You been traveling much?
A lot of research mainly, not so much with lectures and conferences. I've just been sort of hunkered down research and then writing, which is sort of how things, kind of go. It's 1 minute you're doing months of lecturing, and then you're hunkered down doing research and work for the next book or the magazine articles, and I'm kind of in that kind of mode right now. So burning the midnight oil and the daytime oil as well.
I know that feeling. I'm in St. Louis right now, Nick, and a friend of mine works at a local restaurant here, and he's from Italy, and he's just obsessed with UFOs and UFO cases. Is the activity still continuing worldwide?
What, the Men in Black, you mean?
In UFO activity.
Well, yeah, UFO activity, certainly, I get a lot of reports, on a daily basis. Some reports obviously more substantial than others, but I think the key to understanding sort of the frequency of reports is to, focus on the people who are doing the research and collecting the data, because, there's a tendency, particularly on the part of the media, to think if people don't tell them about it, nothing's going on, and people say, well, where have the UFOs gone? Only when you sort of look inwards at the UFO community, you find that we're still, generating a huge number of reports.
Do you find that the media was more interested in UFO cases back around the 50s than they are today?
Well, I think it kind of comes in lows and highs, really, George. I think the one thing that I think is better today is I don't think there's the sort of overwhelming ridicule that there certainly was, a decade or more ago. I think the mainstream media even do seem to treat the subject with a higher degree of seriousness than they did. Yeah, they always have this sort of jokey little, comments at the end about little green men and take me to your leader type jokes. But I think it has improved. And I think any sort of improvement, when we deal with the media and trying to get information out and demonstrate the seriousness of the story, any improvement's better than no improvement. But we've got a long way to go, I think, to be recognised as like a, legitimate subject matter that the mainstream media would cover with the same seriousness as, say, the war in the Middle East or whatever.
Sure. I think the media is beginning to realize that there's something going on here. They might not know what it is, but I'm pretty sure that they think there's something going on, especially with so many witnesses and the great testimony we've been getting over all these years.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, one of the reasons why the media does treat the subject with more seriousness today is because, we have revelations from official files that talk about sightings, pilots, military pilots, airline pilots, radar personnel, and the files clearly demonstrate official interest. And I think, it's difficult even for the media to deny, not to deny the reality of the files, but to deny the significance of them. And so they realise that, as you said, something's going on. But, I think the big problem with the media is trying to get, I guess, a major news outlet to put a crack team of investigative journalists, on the UFO subject for a year to try and break it. And if that was to happen, kind of like Woodward and Bernstein equivalents of for ufology, I think that could make a lot of headway. Unfortunately, that's something we're not seeing, but I think that would be a great inroad for us if something like that did happen.
Oh, would you tell me a little bit about the Real Men in Black and what got you to write the book?
Well, basically, the Real Men in Black, as its title suggests, is a study of the Men in Black phenomenon, or phenomena, as I point out in the book, dating back to the very earliest years of ufology. And it covers, the nature of the phenomenon, the cases, the modus operandi of the MIB, and various theories concerning who or what they might be. Everything from government personnel, aliens, time travelers, paranormal, you name it. Various theories have been advanced for the MIB. And as to your question as to sort of why I wrote the book, primarily it was because in speaking to people, I've lectured on the Men in Black at conferences occasionally, and in speaking to people, the Q&A sessions afterwards, what I found is that most people's, and certainly those who are new to the UFO subject, most people's views are kind of dictated to a large degree by their perceptions gathered from the Men in Black movies with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. They're entertaining movies, there's no doubt, but they just portray one angle, and that is that the Men in Black are simply, super secret agents of some equally super secret government body, if you like. The reality is, as I said, that the Men in Black seem far stranger than that, which is why so many unusual theories have been advanced to try and explain them. So what I tried to do in the book was demonstrate to people that, yes, Hollywood has made a few entertaining movies about the MIB, but the movies actually only portray one angle of a far more complex mystery. So, I've tried to sort of redress the balance and demonstrate what those other aspects are, as well as not, obviously negating the government angle too.
When did the Men in Black start appearing? When was it reported that they were even showing?
Well, things kicked off in 47 with the sort of modern era of flying saucers, UFOs, with the Kenneth Arnold case and Roswell, and a number of high-profile cases in the late 40s and early 50s, culminating with the famous overflight of Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. And there were one or two reports that conceivably could have fallen into MIB in the late 40s, but it was really in the early part of the early 1950s when things really began to take off big time, and people in the UFO field recognized that there was a genuine phenomenon. And this largely, if not almost exclusively, began with a man named Albert Bender. Albert Bender was living in Bridgeport, Connecticut in the early 1950s, and he had an interest in UFOs and also in paranormal, supernatural, both in the world of fact and fiction. He's sort of heavily into gothic horror novels and that sort of thing too. And Bender set up an organization called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And, it was like one of many UFO groups across the country established in that period by members of the public. And I suspect that the group probably went far further in its influence and scope than even Bender himself suspected. Within no time at all, it really captured people's imagination, and subscriptions came flooding in from all across the United States. People wanted to find out more. Even chapters set up in Australia and England. So actually it gathered like a worldwide network. And it became a very much of a surprise and a shock to its members when not too long afterwards, Bender immediately just shut the organisation down and alluded to having been silenced by three guys in black suits who reportedly visited his home, told him that he was getting too close to the truth about UFOs, and if he knew what was good for him, it would be time to leave the UFO subject right now. Which is what Bender basically did. He only surfaced once more to write a book in 1962 called Flying Saucers of the Three Men, which kind of outlined further his experiences.
That's pretty unusual, isn't it, for him to just back off all of a sudden?
Well, that's right. I mean, some people wondered if it was like a publicity campaign to try and further, publicity for the IFSB. That proved not to be the case at all, because Bender just closed the group down and walked away. And, we have had people in the past who, been big players in ufology, and then they've left, and then they've returned afterwards and left and returned again. Bender didn't do that. He just came out of the shadows once, but they said to 1962 to sort of essentially say, look, this is what happened, and wrote the book to lay the story to rest, and then just went away and just would not have anything to do with the UFO subjects ever again. So I think there's little doubt in my mind, in fact no doubt, that Bender did have a very traumatic experience and that he received some sort of visitation. Now, a couple of years after Bender closed the IFSB down, researcher named Gray Barker, who lived in West Virginia, wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which essentially, in part, told the story of Bender and the visit from these three mystery men. In Barker's book, they're kind of described, although it's not specifically said, they are described, or the inferences that they're government people, you know, from like the Air Force, the CIA, and the FBI. The rumours were that there was possibly one from a representative from each agency, and basically saying, look, you know, get out of this subject. We've got enough on our plate without members of the public meddling in areas they shouldn't be meddling. However, when Bender surfaced in '62 with his own version of events, the Men in Black don't sound anything like government agencies. In fact, they sound completely the opposite. He describes them as almost being like a paranormal entities. He talks about how he would go out on a Saturday night to the cinema. This is when he was in the early stages of setting the IFSB up. And he would see these like shadowy, wraith-like black garbed characters with glowing eyes that would literally sort of manifest and vanish in front of him. And he began experiencing poltergeist activity in the house. These shadowy figures would manifest in the upper room where he was living. And essentially, he would feel himself like entering into an altered state of mind. And then the Men in Black would appear. So in other words, although, you know, Hollywood has portrayed the Men in Black as definitive government agents, right, the early years of ufology painted them as something very different. It's only later on that, you know, they became just almost like exclusively associated with the government, when the reality was, you know, they came across almost like modern day vampires or something like that when you read Bender's version of the account.
Well, that's right. They come across as being very cold looking, very gray, very pasty looking, black eyes, almost no personality at all, almost like zombies, right?
Yeah, that's actually a very good way of putting it. I mean, a lot of the witnesses describe these strange MIB as sort of pale, almost to the point of, you know, looking white. You know, they've got some sort of blood disorder or whatever, you know, or anemia or something like that, or anorexia. They don't seem overly conversant with our customs and modes of talking and fashions. The clothes always seem slightly out of date. You know, yeah, they've got black suits, which plenty of people wear black suits today. But in today's MIB reports, they wear the old fedora type hats, you know, from the 40s and 50s, which you don't really see many of today, but they still wear them. They don't seem aware of our basic customs. They seem to falter when they're talking to us. And many of them actually, the witnesses describe them as having bulging eyes, with one witness quite accurately said they had like thyroid eyes, and they were sort of hiding them behind these wraparound sunglasses. Many of them are extremely short, like 5 feet to 5 feet 2 or 3, which, you know, is short for a man. So, you know, this is obviously going to sort of set a lot of speculation as to who are these Men in Black? You know, what is the difference between these MIB and the government MIB? Is there a connection, or are they two separate groups, not possibly even working in tandem with each other? And, you know, this is where it gets into sort of really sort of convoluted and complicated areas when you're trying to figure out, you know, the agenda of this group versus that group, but they all kind of look similar and to a degree at least kind of blend in with each other as well. Did witnesses explain what the Men in Black wanted? What were they trying to do? Well, I mean, it seems more than anything else that the whole goal of the meetings, if you like, is intimidation. Now, there are actually very few reports where people have said, you know, the MIB threatened them with death or killing them, or, you know, said you'll have a mysterious car accident if you don't get out of the subject. It's more like a veiled threat where you're forced to sort of put the dots together, you know, and figure out the answer. But the inference is there that, you know, if you don't leave the subject alone, something bad will happen. But it's never explicitly said, you know, in sort of really stark terms. But it nevertheless, you know, it does instill that feeling and that idea in the witness. And it seems to be the case that, you know, sort of outright, as I said, murder or whatever isn't part of the agenda, but sort of scaring the life out of the person is, you know, whoever the MIB are. That's always the approach they take. And, you know, in most cases, it actually works because, I mean, you imagine most of the Men in Black reports occur at night. You know, somebody's not sitting at home watching the TV there'll be a slow knock on the front door, they open it, and there's this 2 or 3 sort of weird-looking, emaciated little guys in black suits. And the person just goes against all logic, almost as if, their mind or their will has been taken away from them. They open the door, let the people in, and they're basically interrogated in their own living room and intimidated. And then the men in black ask the most strangest questions. Some have nothing to do with UFOs, and they just get up and leave. And what this actually does, the overall effect that I've found interviewing a lot of witnesses, is that many of them develop like a high degree of paranoia afterwards. And almost like post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's so traumatized them, that they're constantly looking through the blinds to see if there's another black car outside. And, every click on the telephone, every letter in the mail that's arrived late is evidence, of MIB tampering. And there are people whose lives actually been quite drastically affected because they've got so sucked into this mystery.
Well, and I've never heard of anybody say that the men in black took notes or brandished a weapon of any type. Have you?
No, that's right. It's almost as if the image of, coming around to either collect data or to silence people is a bit of a ruse. You're quite right. We don't have reports of tape recorders, old cassette players back in the 70s, notepads, pens, anything like that. It's just they kind of sit there, as you rightly pointed out, kind of zombified almost. As if they're not even listening to the witness, it's almost as if they're almost kind of like a manufactured life form, as some people believe, with a short lifespan. They're just there to do a job, and then they leave. And people say maybe they week out of existence. They're just kind of like a semi-creation from who knows where. But you're right that everything about the MIB in terms of, the government people or whatever is illogical because they just don't follow the standard procedure you would imagine. Flashing ID cards, taking notes, etc. It's almost like an ethereal, creepy kind of interview, and then they just sometimes don't even thank the people and they're just gone out the front door.
It is. So you think they'd have little cameras with them? Let's take a picture of you before we get your testimony. It's none of that. Why do people let them in?
Well, this is actually a very good question, and that's a theme that runs through many reports. What I found, and this is why one of the important things why I feel that the mystery is a genuine one and a legitimate one, is that many people, they open the front door, as I said, 10:30 at night, you're going to wonder who it is at 10:30 knocking on your front door anyway. Most people in the worst case scenario is going to think, oh my God, it's the police, there's been an accident and they're coming around to tell me, somebody's been killed in a car crash or whatever. So that's kind of strange. They turn up late and people just open the front door and, they invite them in. They sit them down and the person in their own home, basically gets battered, emotionally and psychologically battered. By intimidation, and then they leave, and then when the MIB have gone, then it's almost like logic returns back to the person. It's like, well, why did I let them in? Why did I let them put me through that?
That's right.
Why didn't I call the police? Why didn't I take a photograph of them? And as I point out in the book, there's so many cases fall into that category that it leads me truly to believe that I think the stranger MIB seem to have the ability to hold sway over our mind in some respects, almost like a subliminal form of hypnosis, where they seem to have target the logical part of the human mind and essentially sort of close it down for the purpose of the visit. And then when they're gone, the person kind of drifts back to normality again and realizes that potentially dangerous situation they put themselves in. And if that was just in one country, I mentioned in the book stories that fall into that exact category of this sort of lack of or loss of logic from the United States or even from elsewhere. And it is a trend, and I don't think it's just down to trauma or the astonishment of being confronted by these guys. I think there's something weird where our mental faculties are actually being either taken over or distorted to allow the interview or the interrogation to go ahead where we don't do anything to stop it.
We're talking with Nick Redfern. His book, The Real Men in Black. Did you know that there was a Mothman sighting in the 60s with the Men in Black? We'll be back. Well, for just pennies a day, you can become a Coast Insider and take part in video chats, regular chats, downloads, podcasting, and have all kinds of fun. Don't forget the Coast to Coast mobile, by the way, up and running now for iPhone and Android as well. Simply go to coasttocoastam.com. When we come back, more with Nick Redfern as we talk about the real Men in Black in the last hour of our program tonight. Not only will we take phone calls with Nick, but if you have been visited by the Men in Black, check in with us too. We'll do that later on in the program. Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Back in the 60s, Nick, of course, we had the Mothman sightings in West Virginia, and you say in your research that the Men in Black turned up there. What do we know?
Yeah, this is kind of a weird one, George. I mean, this is, one of the things I point out is, although, predominantly the Men in Black are associated with UFOs, they do sort of cross over into other avenues of research as well. And certainly the most graphic one would be the Mothman. Now, I'm sure all the listeners have heard of Mothman, whether they've read the book Mothman Prophecy written by John Keel or seen the Richard Gere movie made in 2002 that was based on Keel's book. Basic story is that in the 1960s through 1967, sightings were made in and around the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and this weird creature became known as Mothman. And although the name, is kind of a little bit cartoonish in terms of how it sounds, the reality of the situation is very different. The Mothman was described as like an ominous, shadowy creature, large wings, glowing eyes. It was very sort of seen as brooding and menacing, and the sightings culminated in the collapse of Point Pleasant Silver Bridge, as it was called, which spanned the Ohio River. And when it collapsed, which was when it obviously crossed the river, when it collapsed, literally dozens of cars fell into the water and dozens of people were killed. And a number of researchers, and certainly people living in the area, speculated and believed that the Mothman's presence intimately connected with the disaster. Some people view Mothman as, I guess, like a grim reaper come calling. Others see Mothman as kind of like a warning entity. In other words, that, maybe it turns up not to cause havoc and disaster, but to try and warn people that it's lurking, which is an interesting theory. But regardless of which particular theory is correct, at the same time that the Mothman was seen lurking around Point Pleasant, a lot of UFO activity, and also the Men in Black turned up as well. And a number of the stories relative to the Men in Black sightings in Point Pleasant came from a woman named Mary Hire, who's a local journalist in the area. She was actually the Point Pleasant correspondent for another West Virginia newspaper called Messenger. And she actually received several visitations from the Men in Black when she was working late at night in the offices. And she described one of these, for example. He was a little guy, actually under 5 feet high, and she said he had a pair of weird hypnotic eyes and had big soles on his shoes that made it almost look like they got lifts in. So, he was a really short guy and had this sort of 1960s bald type haircut and just looked very, very odd and strange. And he began asking about UFOs and things like this, and had there been any UFO activity in the town? And she said, well, yes, I'm a local journalist, I've been covering these reports, etc. And Mary Hyde said he kept looking at her ballpoint pen very curiously, and he'd never seen it before. And so she said, would you like it? And he sort of snatched it out of her hand, issued this sort of bone-chilling, cackling laugh, and charged out the door into the night, which is, sort of typical, bizarre behaviour of the Men in Black that we see. But there are other reports as well that Mary Hyde talked about. Then on one occasion, 2 Men in Black turned up, and they seemed to have these, as she described as like Asian appearing, looked like twins dressed in black overcoats, and again started asking questions about UFOs. Had there been any UFO activity in the area? And anyone asked Mary Hyde not to publish the details. And she assured that this pair of guys that no, really into silence. Yes, she would publish reports. And one of them said, well, what would you do if somebody told you not to publish these stories? And she said, I'd tell them to go to hell. And they just literally walked out the door. So in other words, it was almost like they were trying to instill Mary Hyde the idea that, what would you do if somebody said, don't publish this report? Kind of a slight intimidation. People around town as well began to report these MIB encounters. People who've seen the Mothman, people who had UFO sightings in the area, would talk about seeing these dark suited characters prowling around, 1, 2 in the morning around their properties. And it got to the point where, the Men in Black mystery, I say it eclipsed Mothman's story in terms of what was going on, but it certainly is an integral part of the mystery, trying to determine why the MIB turn up when Mothman turns up. Is there a direct connection? Were some of the government people trying to figure out what the Mothman was? To a degree, we're speculating even now. But, it seems to be the case that the MIB aren't exclusively tied to UFOs. They seem to turn up, other sort of supernatural and paranormal events as well.
Well, that's pretty dramatic. What do you think? We're going to get into a lot of cases tonight that get your take on this and some of the stories. But what do you think they're at, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, I think, it really does depend on which Men in Black we're talking about. If we talk about the government people, I really do believe that, somewhere deep within the government, there is an incredibly well hidden, very individuals whose job it is to safeguard the really guarded and dark, deep UFO secrets. Yes, we have people like the CIA, the FBI, NSA, etc. investigating UFOs, collating a lot of files, but I still think, beyond them, there's somebody else or a group, sort of like a black budget group, not actual to Congress. I'm sure some MIB reports, if we had all the resources, the files, etc., we'd be able to demonstrate that some of these MIB are government people coming from these groups that are protecting their tracks by essentially dressing like the Men in Black. They realise that it'll stand absurd if people talk about the visitation, from the MIB. But in saying that, as for these weirder MIB, the sheer number of reports I collected for the book, people I interviewed, leads me to believe that they are a very real phenomenon, and that keeping people away from the UFO phenomenon, instilling fear, seem to be the key components of whatever it is that's going on. Now, some people speculate, and I actually think that there could be something to this. The idea that they're almost like an emotional vampire. It's, the people, it sounds a bit, controversial, but people have said that, when the MIB are visited, the people actually feel drained. We're drained. As I've described before, the idea that somebody feels like a diabetic might feel, if they miss dinner and then miss supper and they need an emergency quick fix of food, before they faint or whatever. And that's how a lot of people felt. They felt that the MIB's eyes were pouring into them and literally sort of bleeding them dry of energy. Not like a vampire, but in a psychic fashion. And I actually do believe there is this theory has a great deal of merit to it. I think some of these MIB, with that it turns around like the paranormal and supernatural. But I think whatever the MIB are, they fall into those categories, however you define what they might be. And I actually do think, and I point this out in the book, possibly, instilling the fear in the person is actually the goal. Rather than silencing the people, it's actually to provoke them into a high state of emotion that can be bled dry. And I think that's, it's an ominous and disturbing theory, but I think it does have merit to it.
Do you think they are testing people? That they just want to see how upset they can get them?
Well, that could be. I mean, the one thing I would say is that there's like a lot of psychological drama played out with the MIB stories, by the MIB. When you talk about testing them, it's actually a very good observation because, intimidation, fear, etc. are during these encounters. And like you pointed out, they don't take notes, they don't take photographs or anything like that, but they sit there intently staring at the witness. And, you could argue that they're actually testing the response, the person to their presence, how intimidating the person, how frightened are they?
Yeah.
How much is their mind affected? So I think, that it's big on this, it builds some nuances, that the beginning of constantly getting a bigger picture of what's going on.
Sure, will people spill their guts when they're intimidated? it could be a research project, you know?
Well, yeah, and I think, what I also think is going on is that there are people in government who actually actively imitate the weirder Men in Black. I think there are government agents, there's the stranger Men in Black, and then there are also government people who think, well, hang on, we can exploit this mystery for our own end. Instead of flashing ID cards and then having John Smith running to his congressman complaining about what we're doing, how about we, portray ourselves as these stranger MIB, and then we know that if people report it, no one's going to take it seriously. So I think they actually employ the patterns of these other MIBs. So they actually, the government people may not really have a full understanding of who the other ones are. I think you've got several categories running around, all with different agendas, sometimes crossing paths, sometimes not. And we're the poor souls left trying to figure it all out.
John Keel, that was the author, of course, of the Mothman Prophecies, while we're talking about them, he was confronted by an MIB, wasn't he?
Yeah, this is one of the strangest and certainly most sensational stories that I uncovered for the book. John Keel, as you rightly pointed out, Keel was a sort of groundbreaking author of a number of very good books, not just the Mothman Prophecies, but also Cosmic Question, Operation Trojan Horse. And Keel was someone who really sort of brought together different facets of ufology, paranormal, etc., and suggested, we could be dealing with one sort of overreaching phenomenon that may be responsible for a lot of the mysteries of our planet, rather than all being sort of independent, separate things. And one of the people I interviewed, so I wanted to get people's views on researchers like Keel to see how their Men in Black views were kind of created and nurtured over time. One of the people I interviewed was Brad Steiger. Brad was quite happy to talk about people's MIB cases that he investigated. When we got to Keel, Brad said, well, I have an interesting story about Keel. I've never really spoken about it, but Keel's dead now, and I feel he told me, I feel I can relate it to you. And Brad told me that on one occasion, when he met Keel, he sort of started contacting him in the mid-60s, and they would meet for dinner, etc. And on one occasion, Keel confided in Steiger that he was in his apartment one night, and three Men in Black, I won't say visited him, but literally, he was told Steiger, they literally kind of manifested through the front door, as if they were kind of semi-ethereal, not even physical entities in some respects, but just quite literally manifested through the door like a spectral being. And this sort of really freaked out Keel, who, I guess, thought he'd seen and heard it all and done it all. And if you read Keel's books, the Men in Black pop up in a lot of them, and he does view them in serious tones and as sort of creepy, uncanny creatures. And based on this story that Brad told me, and Brad said he was absolutely convinced that, Keel wasn't pulling his leg or playing a joke. He said he looked deadly serious and frightened when he told him, how the MIB appeared. This makes me believe that this event probably, directed a lot of Keel's views, opinions, and writing, on the Men in Black. It kind of prompted him to go down this particular paranormal pathway for them. And I'm sure it's pretty much like a life-changing experience, to see these guys literally, kind of come through the door and then start threatening you. It's difficult to explain cases like that. And, all we can do is sort of struggle with the evidence and try and get to the bottom of it.
What do we know about the Men in Black episodes in Scotland at the Loch Ness?
Well, yeah, again, this is another perfect classic example of how, the Men in Black turn up in the strangest places, where places which are already noted for weird activity, like Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and certainly Loch Ness, Scotland, is no different. Loch Ness, everybody associates Loch Ness with the Loch Ness Monster, or monsters, if there are unknown animals in Loch Ness, which I think there are, there would have to be a colony of them rather than, just one or two, unless, they have, and I also think it's a possibility, they have some sort of paranormal overtone to them rather than just flesh and blood. And, Loch Ness is a weird place. None other than Aleister Crowley famous occultist actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness in the early part of the 20th century and was engaged in rites and rituals there to try and summon up demons. There have been UFO sightings of Loch Ness. Lots of high strangeness. But one of the people who looked into the mystery of Loch Ness was a man named Ted Holliday. And in the 60s and early 70s, Holliday spent a lot of time at Loch Ness and initially believed and concluded that the Loch Ness monsters were probably some sort of unknown animal or possibly a creature that survived extinction that science believed became extinct in the long distant past. The more Holliday began to look into the story of the Loch Ness Monster, the more he came around to the idea that it wasn't just weird, it seemed almost too weird. And he began to experience bizarre coincidences and synchronicities while he was at the loch. There were stories about him trying to photograph the monster and cameras were jamming and pictures were coming out of fog. And this sort of really, baffled Holliday to where he came to not, to view reality as something very different to the way he originally perceived it, quite understandably. On one occasion, when his research was denied, he had this creepy feeling when he was near the shore of the loch that someone was watching him. And sure enough, some sort of classic front-top man in black, just staring ominously and sort of coldly in his direction. And it really did sort of chill Ted Holliday to the bone. If you know the man didn't say it, it was just this horrible sort of feeling of dread that seemed to envelop Ted Holliday. Now, what made it even more disturbing was that exactly 1 year later, the very same place where the man in black was standing at the time, Ted Holliday was felled with a near fatal heart attack. He realised as the ambulance was basically, pulled up and just put on the stretcher and stretched out of the area, he realised it was exactly where the man in black had been standing the previous year. And unfortunately, he did die young. He died I think he was 59 when he died in 1979. And so, he had a tragic end, which health-wise, you can speculate wasn't helped by this man in black encounter that subsequently, he had a heart attack in the same area. So, we have disturbing cases like this, but they're baffling as well because it leads, has nothing to do with UFOs, but it leaves the MIB with kind of hovering around the fringes of cryptozoology and related things like that.
It sure does. We'll get into a lot of that next hour. So, as we look at this, and I want to talk about the possibilities of these men in black being extraterrestrial, government employees. What if they're not that? Either one. What if there's some kind of life form from this planet and they just want to know what's going on? Is that possible or is that very remote?
No, I think, I think one thing with the MIB is all bets are off, when it comes to theories, because when you're dealing with a phenomenon that is so strange, then I think, the onus is on us to not avoid looking for strange theories as to what's going on. I think, that's natural and it's right we should do that. I mean, there has been speculation, the idea, for example, research that Guy Manconis put together, the theory of so-called crypto-terrestrials, as he called them, the idea that, could it be that in the ancient past on our Earth, there were species more advanced than us that related to us, and that have largely become extinct, and the human race has sort of taken over and infested the planet. They've been reduced to sort of living on the fringes of society underground or remote location. And he speculated, some of these human-like entities, could they actually be crypto-terrestrials like ancient offshoots of the human race, sort of far more advanced? And when you see hear the stories of the MIB, where they look kind of like us, but they cover their heads, with these fedoras and wraparound glasses, they wear trench coats and the collars. It's almost as if it's done not just for effect, but for camouflage. In other words, by coming out at night and kind of moving around the city in darkness in these particular outfits.
Well, they're almost like robots. Nick, we're at the top of the hour. Hold on, we'll be right back on Coast to Coast. More to talk with Nick Redfern about. He's the author of the latest book, The Real Men and we're going to get into some of the case history stories and just yeah. Okay, Nick, let me throw out these other possibilities and have you react to them in terms of the possibilities of who these men in black might be. Let's talk government agents, first of all. Any evidence that would support this?
Yeah, it actually is, George. This is one of the, the more significant areas that, a lot of people talk about, the government angle. But the big problem has always been how we track down this particular category of MIB and prove it. And I actually think I've now done that. One of the people I interviewed for the book was a woman named Anne Henson, who lives in England. She lives in the south of England. And she said when she was a young girl in her late teens in 1962, she had a UFO encounter over the hills behind the farm that her family was living on at the time. And she said this ball of light would come past or hover over the hill and then shoot away at high speed. On several nights, she saw it like 1 or 2 in the morning, and she kept actually had a friends of mine keep along and drew a picture for her own use, like the hills and the object maneuvering between the hills. And essentially after 3 or 4 days of wondering what on earth this object was, it wasn't a star, because she saw stars over the hills all the time. So she contacted the local Air Force base and said, I've seen this thing, I've done drawings, like pencil notes, compass drawings, etc. And they said, that's very interesting, thank you. And that was the end of it, or so she thought. But what happened a few days later was that, again at night, there was this bang on the front door, and answered the door. And it was essentially a guy in a black suit who pulled up in an old black car and said he went out speak to her about her UFO experience, and told me that she sat down with this guy and he said words to the effect of, well, there's no point you telling anybody because no one's going to believe you. So there was the slight bit of intimidation going on. As I said, he flashed an ID card but didn't have a military uniform on. He was just dressed entirely in black. And he said to her, can I take your drawings and compass notes? And she said, yeah, sure. And he promised to bring them back. And then, of course, she never saw them again, which again is a classic aspect of MIB stories where the MIB confiscates any sort of evidence. And the interesting thing about this story is that, for the most part, if you like, that's where a lot of MIB stories begin and end. We get a fascinating description for the witness, but how do we take it that one step further and prove it? Well, this is probably one of the most important cases on record because several years ago, the British Ministry of Defence, when it began declassifying its UFO files, one of the batches from the 1960s actually contained the official Royal Air Force intelligence file on Anne Henson's encounter, and it demonstrated that the man who come out to visit her was a Sergeant A.W. Scott, who was attached to a division of the British Royal Air Force called Provost and Security Services. The Provost and Security Services are like the American Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and the NSS, they investigate things that have a bearing on national security, counterintelligence, psychological warfare operations, so the idea that, just sort of masquerade or present themselves as the MIB, confiscate UFO data, vanish into the night, and hopefully have nobody be able to track them down. Certainly wouldn't. It wouldn't have been able to verify our story. I did not think the fact that, as I said, the MIB division actually declassified experience. For say this case to the level, the police so heavily they definitely do have no storage. Well, yeah, I think that's very viable. I mean, when you look at these MIB, they look strange. I mean, it's really nice to describe them. They're short. That's actually the way I describe some of them. It's almost, in alien abduction lore literature, where we hear stories of little hybrids. That's how that some of them across. They seem to be like a curious combination of human and much the grey is like, something where there's a fourth generation where there's significantly more human-like equally speakly look to them as well. When you see them camouflage, scary. Are they saying it like us? That want to know how do we know about them? And so people trying to get some moving amongst us. I think there's something it's almost like a non-plus experience of their face, where they're just engaging with the things you say because they just don't give anything away. It's almost like they just say that it's intimidating and possibly even blatant drive emotion even. But in terms of expressing anything like emotion, any sort of visible, we just don't see that anymore. Like, the mind is empty, but it just running on the same wavelength as us, emotion, surprise, whatever,
Tell me about this case in the cemetery in Old
It's an interesting one because it's that's given them anybody and they just like to get a lot of people when I've spoken to them, and certainly, in recent years, this is one of the reasons why it's writable. A lot of people assume that mystery was simply, an issue of the 40s, 50s, 60s that had simply gone away. But, there's actually not the case. Very, very well. You mentioned the case of the Albany Cemetery. The Albany Rural Cemetery is just situated just there, the short distance out of Albany, New York. One of the things that's there is Charles Law, sort of feeling that she felt coming from this vehicle, this entity, and it really sort of showed that rigid chilling, where she backed away from the subject, felt that we started to people, at least this category isn't, and she felt it really had supernatural power of love to her, to the point where she just felt that she should not be dealing with the MIB, when you look, they try and get their grips into you and manipulate you and intimidate you. That was what she felt. It really was the case. She felt that she went looking and they came calling.
It is a strange phenomenon.
Very strange.
About that. Has anybody ever been able to, capture them on either video or film or anything like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes. I mean, I'll sort of preface that by saying that one of the documents I included in the book, which is surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, is an Air Force document from the 60s, which talks about how the military were trying to catch a man in black, You know, the irony is we're sort of sitting here talking about the MIB, a lot of people think they're from the government, and then you find government files from the 60s saying, you know, who are these guys going around intimidating UFO witnesses? You know, we need to catch one of them. So it's like the government was trying to catch them. Now, to the best of our knowledge, you know, nobody in the UFO field has literally caught a man in black. And, you know, we don't have evidence that the government has, but, you know, we cannot rule that out. But they have been caught on film. Now, I interviewed several people for the book, two being Jim Moseley and Timothy Green Beckley, who are long-time players in the UFO subject and have been, you know, literally the subject in Jim's case since the early 50s and Tim since the early 60s, and they're still around now. Jim publishes a newsletter called Sources Smear, and Tim points out, I don't know how many books Tim's put out, but you know, he churns them out. But I don't know how he does it. There's a lot of interesting books on UFOs. And in the mid-1960s, late 1960s, there was a lot of UFO people in and around the New York area, where both Jim and Tim were living at the time, respectively. And one of the people who was deeply involved in the area at the time in UFO research was a man named Jack Robinson, and he was married to a woman named Mary. And Jack was someone who's a well-respected UFO researcher in New York, New Jersey, and he had a number of files, you know, filing cabinets containing records. And one particular occasion in 1968, it seemed like something had been rifling through his files, which is something that Albert Bender also reported years earlier, as if somebody had been clandestinely in the apartment. At the same time, Mary said after Jack would go to work, she would look out the window and there was this weird, almost like a zombie-like man in black staring up at the apartment. Seemed to show no emotion. He was sort of hidden back in the recesses of a old building opposite the apartment. And he had sort of this chilling, totally emotionless expression on his face. Had the hat, the long coat, sunglasses even, just eerily staring up at her. And she said she saw him on 3 or 4 occasions, and it really sort of creeped her out. You know, there was something about the man that was just unsettling, just didn't sit well with her. And she related this story to Tim Beckley and Jim Moseley. Because the guy had turned up, apparently it was just standing there over the course of 3 or 4 days, Tim phoned Jim up and said, you know, well, why don't we get out there and, you know, see if we can catch him in the act, so to speak. That's exactly what they did. They drove over to Jersey City, and sure enough, 8 o'clock in the morning, the guy was there just zombified, staring up at Robinson's window. So Jim was driving the car, slowed down to crawling speed, and Tim snapped off a photograph, which they were both kind enough to allow me to reproduce in the book. And it does show this weird guy stood in the recesses of the doorway with the hat and the sunglasses, and he does kind of have like this odd expression, just, you know, blank on his face. A very odd story.
Creepy looking, isn't it?
Yeah, it is sort of creepy. That's the word a lot of people use, and they don't really know why they find them creepy. It's just something unsettling. One of them described it to me. The man in black had kind of an expression where they said it looked like a dog looks when it's about to bite, and you kind of back away. You know, and that's how they got the feeling that there was just something almost like unapproachable or menacing about them. But there's another example I talk about in the book as well, which also dates from the late 1960s, involving a researcher named Alan Greenfield, who's also done a massive amount of research into Men in Black phenomena. And he told me when I interviewed him how he had an experience in 1969. This was at the National UFO Conference in Charleston, West Virginia. Now, of course, West Virginia is where the Mothman was seen a few years earlier.
Point Pleasant, right?
Yeah, exactly. But Alan had had this sort of run-in with a man in black who seen him and people he was with. And Alan saw this sort of guy on the street, went running after him and confronted him. Literally got a head and shoulders photograph of him. Now, you know, people say, well, hey, you know, it's not just some guy in a black suit. What happened next after Alan took the photograph was very weird. He said that the man in black ducked around the corner of the street. Alan went chasing after him, rounded the corner, and the guy was just completely gone, and there was just nowhere for him to go to. You know, and even Alan speculated, you know, could he have been some sort of Walter Mitty guy who was just playing, you know, James Bond or whatever. But Alan said the sheer weirdness of him just vanishing into thin air right around the corner was something that, you know, stuck with him to this very day. He just has no way to explain that. And, you know, so we do have at least a couple of photographs showing that the MIB, you know, can be captured if we sort of diligence and we're in the right place at the right time. But physically, you know, they're still eluding us, almost to the point of it being eerily elusive.
Has anybody ever taken a pot shot at one of these Men in Black or jumped them or anything like that?
Not that I'm totally aware of, George. I mean, I think one of the main reasons is because I said that it's almost like people's free will or sense of logic goes away and they just sort of sit there dumbstruck, you know, basically being lectured at or intimidated and not doing anything about it. You know, maybe as I speculate, the MIB realised that, you know, if the person isn't rendered into this kind of almost like an altered state, you know, they might try and hold them there and tell the police, you know, and sure in the house. But that never happens. And I think it is almost like a safety mechanism on the MIB's part that they have this ability to hold sway over us, over the logical part of our mind. And that's why they are so elusive, because the very things we could do to catch them or prevent them from escaping or photograph and film them, we rarely ever do it.
How do they show up? Do they show up in a car, or do they just, you know, walk out? How do they get there?
Well, that's kind of another weird thing as well. I mean, there's some cases where people, you know, seen a UFO and then told no one about it at all. I mean, literally no one at all. And yet, the next night, you know, they'll do the slow thump on the front door. When they open the door, sometimes there's like an old black car in the street. Often people describe them as being like 1950s, 1960s Lincolns, or, you know, old-type cars with sharp ears.
The old Cadillacs, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Cadillacs. But they look brand new, but they're sort of curiously out of time. You know, they're kind of like people, you know, who restore old vintage cars. They're kind of like that. They look brand new, but everything about them smacks of being old. In other cases, the MIB just literally turn up, and the person, when they leave, you know, there's just no car there. They go down the drive, and they just sort of vanish into the darkness. So that sort of begs the question, where did they come from? Other times, you know, they get there almost too quickly. There are cases where people have a UFO experience, raced home to tell their wife or husband, and the MIB have been on the doorstep 20 minutes later. You know, we sort of beg the question, how does that happen?
It sounds like there's some telepathy or something. Nick, we're going to come back in a moment. We're going to talk about the FBI's involvement with Men in Black as well. In addition to more of these cases, we'll also be talking about Lauren Coleman, our dear friend, the cryptozoologist, in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, 2012, it's getting closer. We'll talk about that. Next hour, we'll take phone calls with Nick Redfern, and we'll be back with him in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Nick, why would the FBI be interested in Men in Black stories?
Well, this is actually one of the stranger things that I found doing the research, George. I often use the Freedom of Information Act when I'm looking for information on UFOs when you're trying to get further corroboration for a story. And what I've found over the years is that, instead of just filing for UFO reports, I also file for the people involved in the cases as well. And to that end, I've got whole FBI files over the years on people like George Adamski and George Castle, the famous contactees, and a lot of people, like J. Allen Hynek, the whole of these FBI files, various people, significant players in the UFO subject. And so I filed for requests for any documentation that might exist of Albert Bender and Ray Barker, who were sort of really responsible for kicking off the Men in Black mystery in the early 50s. Didn't really expect to get hold of any files at all, but I was pleasantly surprised when I actually did get a batch of files, probably about 40 pages altogether of FBI documents on collectively together Bender and Barker. And certainly without doubt the most profound document in the collection was the late 1950s memorandum from none other than J. Edgar Hoover himself, actually ordering one of his agents to get hold of a copy of Ray Barker's book on the Men in Black. They knew too much about flying saucers. So in other words, at the height of Men in Black activity in the 50s, none other than the director of the FBI wanted to know who the Men in Black were. Now, this is important, I think, for several reasons. One, it shows the FBI were monitoring the MIB situation and the people within the subject, but also it demonstrates that whoever the MIB were, they weren't the FBI. And so that begs the question of, well, if the FBI is having to try and figure out who the MIB are with all their manpower and expertise, who on earth are they? But to find that J. Edgar Hoover was actually himself, looking into this mystery was something that I think it just didn't even occur to me that I would ever find anything like that. Now, from there, we do have examples of where, for example, the FBI has further involvement in the Men in Black mystery. I talk about a case from 1960 where a witness had, within UFO law, the case basically had become known as a Man in Black encounter, but it was one that I was able to validate. Again, we're able to turn it back to the government angle and actually sort of suggest, that the phenomenon could be traced back, in some cases at least, to government personnel. And this one in particular, the case in question, involved a man named Joe Perry, who lived in Grand Blanc, Michigan. He took a photograph of a UFO, and the story going around was that two men posing FBI agents came along, confiscated the photograph, and he never got it returned. A sort of classic MIB encounter. But through the Freedom of Information Act, the files on Joe Perry's case have actually surfaced, and they identify as real FBI agents. So this is just one case where I had mentioned story from England in the early 60s, where a bit of the system has demonstrated that what began as sort of weird MIB encounter, we were able to trace it back to official. And I think again that's important to demonstrate some of these cases. Like this regard to the FBI, we have also like the lot of just FBI agents, especially the part of the MIB history, where we testify where we can at least demonstrate that some of these MIB, we give a point of origin that we can actually prove.
Calling that from London, can you have information?
Yeah, he probably was author 1982-83 in London, with his girlfriend retired there in Notting Hill, Colin was walking home one night, saw a strange light in the sky. Yeah, he thinks that, let's say it's described as like shapeshifters. It shapeshifted like there was just a bright light to an aircraft, and then bizarrely to the shape of one of the controversial and classic like triangle type UFOs. So whatever it was, it was capable of sort of cloaking or camouflaging itself with at least several different incarnations, if you like. So Colin Ray to tell his girlfriend excitedly about what had happened. Got to the front door of the apartment, went in, and lo and behold, this typical man in black sat there on the couch. Tommy was kind of like swallowed, just totally jaw dropped. The man in black effectively having close contact, Tommy didn't know the floor of Colin and his girlfriend. I know you're probably girlfriend, you're not going to go, and just have it coming away. And again, we have to think that concepts going out the window, and he let the song, that's just one of the times, it's like a dangerous area, but she just let the guy in and sat down. It's almost like he's taking away from Colin to go home, because Colin suddenly again, not the same time, he's gone out the window, spilled up all the details of the UFO encounter. And with hindsight, Colin said he was all those things about in black, just specifically there to show me Colin's reaction to the UFO encounter. I wanted to see how he described it, what Colin thought of it. And when Colin had completed the narrative, the man in black basically stood up and said, it's time for me to go. I won't hang around any longer. Colin again also felt that was sort of beyond coincidence that, when he told his story, the man left. Felt that the idea that he was really there just to visit somebody who lived in the past was just, a route. And it was actually gone out with an instead of both of us described the man in black, just found that maybe not like that at all. But it's definitely important because it also contains one of the other central facets of the man back at the MIB terms of not just frequently, but impossibly frequent. There is the important cases there, the government like the fact that this is cases there in England, and we have different cases in the US, really all of that. And again, as I said, it was not with the MIB left or college or said you don't have to shout that, but why not just put it in? So they come from the front door, basically get a and say, who are you? What were you doing at our apartment? And he's not even on the staircase. And Colin said a big story or his name discovery for 30 years, and he just, for all the things Colin said about seeing and done, this incident just overwhelming with complexities, and he classic it's like a classic encounter with an MIB.
It's a great story, and of course, our dear friend Warren Coleman had one back in the 70s. First of all, how'd you get all these stories? This is big extensive research.
Well, what I'm trying to do, I treat any sort of story that I investigate, as you would any journalistic story. You just employ and track people down and just speak to people. And you get trying to know, or how many people in the UFO field have evidence of surveillance of the cell, people watching, mail interference, electronic interference. And some things, we're just happy to share case files and then put me in touch with the witnesses. For example, eventually we had to put me in touch with Claudia Trinidad, the old family story. But I interviewed him about the photograph that he took with Jim Mosley. So probably sort of spiral of other people. Definitely the owners of the club, depend on us to set those steps to the next person. And that's what I do. I try and just employ the regular methods you would use if you were looking into any sort of news story, really. But Lauren's story is a very, again, creepy one. It was basically at the time, if I go back to the 1940s first, in an area of Illinois called Mattoon, there was a strange legend began that found on Magdassa and Mattoon. And this was like a creepy man in black character who would reportedly turn up at people's houses and literally knock them out with like some sort of gas, like a knockout gas, and there was stories about him assaulting women or stealing things from the house. But he was essentially a person who was making him unconscious state by some sort of strange odor, magnetism or even lightation or making something out. It sounds like a novel or something like that, like the ingenious technique, but he also had a strange man in black overtones because the man gas described as dressed in long big hats and long toes, darkly dressed, hovering in the shadows. They have these sort of slightly overtones to it. And Lauren had a fascination and interest in these bad gas and that doing story. And he also told similar accounts of other people who seem to be employing similar traits. One of these is a man named Martin Kenyon, who was 75, pleading guilty to carrying on robbery and 36 years in prison. And he told his women as well. And Lauren was looking into the story because of some of the weird parallels. And he told me he was writing individual letters to newspapers in other countries, trying to track down what they published on this particular person. And he was, he's looking at sort of the configuration between this particular case and the Madagascar attack back in the 1940s. And at the height of doing this research, Lauren told us that late one night he was up at one of the Eldorado apartments he was living in at the time. And he said the doctor who was very thin man that he was with the UK police department identified himself as Applegate. And so he was checking into the story, wanting to know why Lauren was looking into this particular man and his exploits, and recommended that Lauren should really research of this. And it's just the man's justification was or the alleged justification was that this particular man, the attacker, like media attention and suggested to Lauren, through no fault of his own, might be his beginning information. So Lauren would have made sense and, basically agreed with him. But the next thing is made no sense at all. A couple of days later, Lauren checked in with the police department and still attended Applegate. So whoever this weird started to man was, it turned later night on Lauren's doorstep, recommending he investigate this case, which has sort of plays on overtones with this 1940s Madagascar story. So it just vanished into the night, using a false name and a false police ID. And Lauren told me, perhaps more close to Lauren, bear in mind the man identified himself as Applegate. Lauren said, well, years later, doing more work on names, I discovered that Applegate was another name for the devil in some literature. It was a very spooky encounter. That's probably a good way of describing Lauren's experience, very spooky.
And then Marie Jones, she's been on the program before, ran off
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of alcohol chaps in the book are people who've had MIV experiences when they were immersed themselves in the alien abduction history. This involved alien abduction research and authors and abductees themselves. And Marie had her own experience, which again she was kind enough to allow me to use in the book. And this basically goes back to the 1990s when she and a friend were starting to look into alien abduction stories on the West Coast, up and down the West Coast of Los Angeles, San Diego, that sort of area. And she told me about how her particular friend she was working with and her husband began to see these sort of shadowy entities outside the house. There would be telephone intimidation and interference. And it even hit Marie after that she began to experience actually quite hostile intimidation. Some of it I pointed out is sort of, they let you join the dots. With Marie, it was nothing like that at all. It was almost, just outright hostility. I think the most ominous thing Marie told me of all was that she would get these strange phone calls and this sort of eerily robotic voice, intimidating her. And he would even tell her what she was wearing in the room when she was on the phone at the time or what book was on the table next to her, as if it was voice on the other end was able to see what was going on in the room. This really spooked Marie out to the point where she said to her friend, I'm just going to drop this abduction research. Marie said to me, she's a strong person. She'll stand up and fight. But this particular case so terrified her and unsettled her that she just walked away from the abduction research, just overwhelmed by this sort of MIB intimidation.
There's an interesting case too with her, and also you know our dear friend Joshua P. Warren.
I know Josh has got a really interesting theory for Men in Black. I interviewed Josh extensively for the book. He not only does Josh have an interest in the MIB phenomenon, but he also has come up with a very intriguing theory for who they may be, which involves nothing to do with aliens or government personnel. But Josh speculates on a theory that they could be time travelers. Now, Josh asks the important question, why do Men in Black wear black? Why do they wear black suits? And Josh suggests, one scenario, if they are time travelers, well, you're going to go back to 2011, 1985, 1960, 1940, 1920, and you want to mingle and mix with the people and not be noticed too much. Arguably, the black suit, is going to be the one, I guess, mode of costume that you can wear in any of those time periods and successfully get away with it. You can't go back to 1920 and wear sort of combat boots and a Nirvana t-shirt.
Or a leisure suit or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the black suit would fit in pretty much any time in the modern day UFO arena. Certainly the hats are a little bit out of date today, but certainly not up until the 1970s, early 70s, late 60s. And Josh wonders if the Men in Black may actually not be sort of our worst nightmare, but could be time cops almost, whose role it is to prevent sort of problems with the timelines or time paradoxes occurring, where the past alters the present and the future. And he speculates that maybe that's why they seem so weird, because, they're constantly operating out of time. And he speculates also maybe that would explain not just the strange mode of dress, but the fact that they always seem to be driving out-of-date cars. It's almost as if in the far-flung future, they're not quite sure of what was going on in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, and occasionally they get things wrong, with the clothing and the vehicles. And
maybe they're traveling in UFOs, and maybe they're time capsules.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a valid question that Josh brings up. Maybe we're not dealing just with UFOs from other worlds or other dimensions. Perhaps with some UFOs really are time capsules, time machines, rather than, spacecraft. And Josh's theory, how he spells it out, is a particularly ingenious one, and it actually does make a great deal of sense. Now, of course, time travel, some people might say it's theoretical, but when you look at Josh's theory, it really does. It makes a lot of sense. He's thought it out deeply, and I came away sort of very impressed by what he had to say. It's like, wow, this is a whole new angle on the MIB that I hadn't considered. And it really does make you wonder, is somebody sort of surfing the centuries and just, they're not our worst nightmare, they're kind of actually trying to protect things and, to ensure that havoc just doesn't break free on the timeline.
Well, that will be fascinating indeed. When we come back in just a moment with Nick Redfern, we'll take your phone calls. If you've had a Men in Black experience, check in with us as well. Plus, we'll also talk about Men in Black and the Ouija board. That's right. There is some kind of a tie-in there as well. Nick's latest book, The Real Men in Black. It's available all over the place. And his websites are linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com. We'll be back in a moment. We'll continue chatting about Men in Black. We'll take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. And if you need to email me, that's George at coasttocoastam.com. Okay, we're going to take your phone calls now this hour with Nick Redfern as we talk about his research book, The Real Men in Black. Your calls and perhaps your stories. Maybe you've been visited. Check in with us on Coast to Coast AM. What's the link, Nick, between the Men in Black and Ouija boards?
This is probably one of the weirder aspects of the entire mystery, George. One of the people I interviewed for the book was an Anglican priest named Ray Beauchesne, who lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. And as well as being an Anglican priest, Ray's also a former state director for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. He used to run the Nebraska chapter of MUFON. And so in other words, he's someone who has a background in the Christian church and also in ufology. And Ray has deeply dug into the UFO mystery and the Men in Black mystery, even to the point of he actually met once Albert Bender and was in touch with Ray Barker also for a number of years. And Ray has come to the conclusion that in his view, the Men in Black have literally like demonic origins. That's his firm conclusion. And one of the things he points out and notes is that a lot of the people who had involvement with the Men in Black or been visited or interacted with them have also been involved in the occult. For example, Albert Bender used Ouija boards. Claudia Cunningham, who I mentioned at the Albany cemetery story, her friend Linda, who had the experience, she was a user of Ouija boards. And Mary Robinson, who saw this weird Man in Black outside her apartment in Jersey City that Tim Beckley photographed, she was a big fan of Ouija boards. And there are other cases where, as Ray points out, that people who had visitations to the Men in Black, when the MIB experiences have occurred, either in the immediate wake or at the very time of the encounters, there have been outbreaks of poltergeist activity in the homes of the people. Now, of course, this sounds highly bizarre and controversial, but there's no doubt that it is an aspect of the phenomenon. And that's why, some people like Ray have gone down the path suggesting that it's far more occult-based than that it is sort of flesh and blood and physical. My own take on it is I do think there's an aspect of this to it, but what I'm more inclined to believe is that this is sort of another aspect of the Men in Black mystery. I don't think it can account for all the Men in Black stories. I think what it does demonstrate is that we have at least 3 or 4 strands of MIB, all sort of under the MIB banner, but some of them actually having wildly different origins. We could actually be looking at government people, aliens, time travelers, and something paranormal that the UFO community has had a tendency to put them all under one banner, when really, we should be looking at them, each case on its own merits, and they may have wildly different origins.
Well, that's a good point. What have you found to be some of your strangest cases that you've come across?
Well, I think everything about the Men in Black certainly smacks of high strangeness. I think more than anything else, it's the sort of the collective ways and means by which the MIB appear and vanish. I think possibly, the oddest thing of all, and I think this is a theory that has a lot of merit, is the theory of tulpas, which has been offered for the Men in Black. The tulpa, the idea is, the human mind, if it focuses on one particular image, can kind of externalize that image and sort of give birth to like a mind monster. Some people speculated, that that's what the MIB are. They're sort of the image of the black suited, intimidating person is sort of deeply rooted in the human consciousness, and we actually kind of, give birth to them. They stride right out of our imagination into the real world. Highly controversial. Certainly one of the other most fascinating for me, but equally controversial aspects, and certainly strange aspects of the mystery, is that particularly in England and America, when the MIB are seen driving these old-fashioned cars, that there are a number of reports on record where the cars just seem to literally, I do mean literally, dematerialize, as if, they've just vanished into nothingness. Again, that sounds highly bizarre, but everything about the Men in Black is bizarre. But we get reports, little-known cases from England that really have, only been told from one friend to another, and then somebody's leaked it out eventually to the UFO community. Paralleling very closely similar stories to the United States, that again takes the MIB stories down a very strange path. They're not only driving old-fashioned cars, these cars seem to have like a limited lifespan. 1 minute they're here, the next minute they're literally gone.
Oh, that's a good point. Let's take some calls here, Nick. Tim in Phoenix, Arizona. Probably brutally hot there, Tim. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Everyone we're officially in the hell zone. Forgive my voice, I have a little congestion here tonight. Some time ago, but this was back in the late 70s when I was still in high school. My cousins and I we frequently go out for coffee after church or whatever and talk about UFOs. And there was one night when we were sitting in the booth, and I was looking out the window to the street as I was telling somebody, the group there about the Negative Party showcase. And just as I got to the point where I was describing the alien, this fairly tall figure, very skinny, walking very stiffly in a black suit, a long sleeve, black tie, walks right down the I get goosebumps thinking about that. And it was walking right in front of me as I'm looking out the window, and everyone looks at me and I'm aghast. It's like the wind was knocked out of me. They look. Totally freaked out, and what was creature, what was being had on, it was a person, okay, I think it was a prank, but it was a weird coincidence, or it could have been another manifestation of the wave of the black, because of the man of black mark, because somebody had the styrofoam, that weird, nylon stocking over that, and put on a very long suit to put it over the head, so that way it looked like a real tall alien, in a black suit. And this was before the Men in Black phenomenon took off in movies and so forth. But we couldn't believe it, just the weird coincidence of that. And I just wanted to throw that one out as another possible way that they people start talking about people.
Well, it's interesting. Halloween's coming a little early. Hey, thanks. Yeah, Phoenix getting blasted away. You know what? What kind of a person, though, would be dumb enough to run around in a Bigfoot costume or dressed up like a Men in Black? I wouldn't.
Well, no, I mean, certainly Bigfoot, you might get yourself shot in the woods, I'm sure that may well happen one day, But, the Men in Black, again, we have these questions. I mean, it's an intriguing story. We do get cases like this, some of which we can resolve, in down to earth terms. Others just silly ludicrous, 40, 50 years onwards.
Next up, we go to Marty in Charleston, West Virginia, east of the Rockies. Hey, Marty, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, I got cut off last time. I got to meet Frank Edwards, who wrote Stranger Than Science and UFO Serious Business.
Cool. He was a classic giant.
He was, and my dad had a bookstore. So I got to listen in on all the conversations that day when he was signing autographs. And he told my dad, after we closed the store, that a female reporter in her 20s that had warned him that she was being followed by these strange men in black, and that he was going to investigate the Redfern County monster incident, which is in West Virginia, and she told him not to because strange things were starting to happen. Well, then it turned out not too long after that, after he warned him, she died suddenly of a heart attack. And she was in her 20s, which is strange.
No, that is. I mean, you do actually get a number of stories like that where people have done research into people in the UFO community who died under questionable circumstances. And there's sort of a growing body of reports now. I mean, to what extent we're able to actually, demonstrate a direct connection with the MIB, that's open to debate. But, there have been a number of cases where I think, like, for example, Morris Jessup, who was one of the big players on the UFO subject in the 50s, his death is still seen by many researchers as highly suspicious. So, I think, although it's sort of an ominous, disturbing area, I think, this is actually a subject that we really should be digging more into. The idea that the threat level goes from not just intimidation, but, if you get really close, it's the ultimate step taken to sort of, prevent you getting any further, and I wouldn't rule it out.
All right, let's go to Christopher in Los Angeles. He's up with us, first time caller. Christopher, hi.
Hi, guys. How you doing? Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate it. I wanted to talk experience that I had back in 2005, and I was researcher familiar with Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. And one night, after studying with my friend Jason, he and I dropped him back home at Cougar Village, which is an apartment complex for students that's dorms basically. And it's in a really thick wooded area. And it's about 3:30 in the morning. It was pretty late. And I dropped him off. I'm driving back. And all of a sudden, out of my left-hand view, I saw this really bright object. And I didn't know what it was. It was really bright, like a star. Sorry, I'm kind of nervous because it was a really intense experience. And this object was glowing. I was on North University Drive to the left, and this object came up from above the tree line, started following me, and followed me for maybe about half a mile to a mile on North University Drive where it meets Old Toad. And I'm sitting there smacking myself in the face 3 times. I thought I was hallucinating or something. It's clearly real. And I came to a 4-way stop, and this object went from probably what was 45, 50 miles an hour to, I mean, honestly, 10,000. It just left the atmosphere in a split second. Raced home, called my friend that I just dropped off, called my girlfriend at the time, and, no one believes me. So I filed a report on, I can't remember what website it was, it's like a UFO.
Probably the National UFO Reporting Center.
I tried to find the most official one that I could find. Yeah. Filed a report. A day later, I get a visit at my front door from a man dressed in black with a hat, really weird looking eyes. And he asked me a bunch of questions, my name, family history, if there was any case of psychosis, if I was crazy, basically.
Did he identify himself, Christopher?
He didn't give his name. He just said that I can't remember what agency that he said he was from. My phone's gonna die.
He made it sound official though, didn't he? All right. Well, we're getting out of range here with you. Have you ever been Nick at all in your work by any of these?
No, people often ask me that, it's sort of difficult. I haven't. The closest I've sort of ever come to anything like this is that occasionally, I've interviewed people where, they would have emailed me and said, I've got a story to tell you. And I'll be like, yeah, great. I'm going to be away for a couple of days. Can I give you a call in, say, 3 or 4 days when I get back? We can chat about it. And then when I call them, the whole tone's changed. They're quite reticent and reluctant. So this has happened perhaps on, a dozen occasions over the course of 15 years. Where it's clear that the person's opened up and said, well, after we first spoke, that, I had this weird phone call where somebody suggested it would be a good idea to talk with you about this experience. And he actually put people on speaker. So, in other words, I've not been intimidated or anything like that. I've not had that sort of visitation. But people I've been planning to interview, it's almost like somebody's intervened to dissuade them from speaking, which of course, sort of begs all sorts of questions around telephone monitoring programs and all sorts of things along those lines, when secret surveillance of people in the UFO community, etc.
I never thought of them as being demonic, but since you brought it up, Nick, it might make sense. It's a strong possibility, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, to me, the demonic angle is an interesting one, but I think, it depends how you define what, demons are, or aren't. I'll be talking about something that's literally demonic, or I'll be talking an entity that we don't fully understand that resides in some other realm or, quasi-dimension, and we give it like a demonic terminology that means to understand what it may be. I think, but there's absolutely no doubt that when you log into this mystery, you do find these sort of occult overtones and poltergeist activity. People use Ouija boards, you've been visited, and, it does take you down some pretty dark and winding and ominous pathway, that you don't initially think you're going to go down. You think it's going to be just government people flashing ID cards and say, hey, just got that UFO research out. It goes far, far beyond that.
All right, let's go to Espanola, Florida, and it's Thomas on Coast to Coast. Hi, Thomas.
Yes, sir. One of the things causes me why in black? Why not in white as in demonic in black, angelic in white? You know, entities or the source, the reason why they tend to conceive themselves as they do. And also in the movies, so they say, it's that they wipe your mind clear of any experience you may have had. And a little bit we know that we're babbling about safety is cause concern of what really happens when we're not around. Do we remember? Is that the purpose of them even contacting you? You know kind of what I'm saying? I'm very intrigued about it. Demonic, angelic, white, black, with right for black.
All right, you might have a point there.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting angle. You know, the sort of the archetypal, sort of shadowy, dark figure. You know, is something that extends throughout history, not just a modern day thing. You know, sort of a black intimidating suit, the hat, the sunglasses. You know, by default, it is all intimidating. And you know, you make a valid point when you talk about sort of the angelic white good angle, and then the sort of the ominous man in black who's, you know, defined as being definitively evil. I mean, to give you an example, you can go back to the 1600s when you had certain alchemists, you know, trying to turn base metal into precious metals. You can find a number of old stories of alchemists from that period who said, you know, they would get a visit late at night from this strange, ominous, black-dressed figure who would warn them about the hazards of, you know, digging into alternative science like alchemy. You know, and they would appear and they just begin vanish into the night with this sort of air of, you know, like an evil presence about them. And, you know, you do have to wonder, are we looking at sort of, you know, left and right hand, like a good and evil type phenomenon? I can't rule it out.
Well, all right, stick with us. We're going to go back, Nick, in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. We're going to take final phone calls here. We'll go to San Bernardino, Yellow Springs in Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, the state of Washington, and much more as we talk with Nick Redfern, Real Men in Black. On Coast to Coast AM, I'm George Norrie. Don't touch your dime. And as I mentioned on our next Coast to Coast program, we are going to be talking about 2012 when we come back. Final phone calls with Nick Redfern. Coast to Coast AM. And here we go, back with Nick Redfern. You'll find calls as well on Coast to Coast AM. With these strange stories, surprising stories, was it difficult for you, Nick, to get the research done, or did it come easy?
I would say, you know, when I sort of got into it deeply, George, it probably did come fairly easy because I found, you know, the more doors I was able to open and sort of take people into, you know, sort of my confidence, then if they had stories to tell of other people they knew, they would speak to them for me and say, you know, hey, this guy's, you know, writing about it, he's going to treat it seriously. You want to speak to him? So, you know, that worked well, but I will be the first to admit, you know, when you're dealing with sort of the historical angle going back 50, 60 years, then, you know, we need to try and get insight from the people who are still around who were there, which is precisely why I interview people like Jim Mosley and Brad Steiger, because, you know, it's incredibly important when we're dealing with 40-year-old cases or 50-year-old cases when it comes to people like Albert Bender, or nearly 60 years old now. You know, we need the insight of the people who were there. I mean, you know, the witnesses, the people who had the recollections. That's why, you know, I spent so much time extensively interviewing people for the book. Was simply because, you know, I wasn't there. You know, those people were the people who know what they're talking about. So I felt that's, you know, that was an important issue.
Well, that's absolutely true. And let's look at your personal opinion now. What do you think these people are, these things?
Okay. Well, as I said, I'm absolutely convinced that some MIB are government personnel. You know, there's no doubt about that.
Meshing in, getting there, doing what they do. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and I actually think they do exploit this sort of weird MIB motif and act kind of strange occasionally to cover their tracks because it is a good camouflage. You know, it makes the person look crazy if they talk about it. So I think there is the government angle. Now, as for what these weirder men in black are, I have to be honest. I mean, sort of several minds. I think there's definitely a paranormal quality to them, but equally there seems to be like a substantial flesh and blood angle to them as well. So, are we looking at entities that sort of straddle both realms? Or are we actually looking, as I suspect might be the case, and this sort of takes it down even more confusing pathways, that we try and pigeonhole the Men in Black to be this or that. Maybe it really is the case that, some, as Josh Warren suggested, maybe some really are time travelers, maybe some are demons, maybe some are government people, maybe some are paranormal, others are trickster-like entities. Perhaps, it's our tendency as human beings to want to classify things into simplistic terms. What if we really do have like a whole menagerie of Men in Black that have wildly different origins and intent and reasons for sort of moving amongst us? I think that could be a possibility, that we're not looking at just one or two potential origins. There could be a whole, like a school of Men in Black, that we call them Men in Black, but there are subtle differences between the different types of phenomena.
Well, who or whatever they are, they sure do intimidate people, don't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is the one thing that really does stand out, is that they're almost like life-changing experiences for people who've had UFO encounters. If you say you've seen a UFO, most people are quite interested, actually. A lot of people don't get ridiculed. But when you have the MIB experience, what it seems to do more than anything else is it has a profound psychological and negatively psychological effect upon the person, whether it's a witness or in the case of people like Albert Bender, who's a researcher. The person doesn't just feel sort of threatened and intimidated where they don't talk about the case. It then seems to impact on other areas of their lives. That there are cases where people have felt too stressed to leave the house for weeks, and then when they did go out, they started having panic attacks and things like that, purely and simply because of this bizarre experience. The people who they've had mail arrive late to the point where they become obsessed with watching the mailbox, for fear of the Men in Black are going to turn up. And I find this, although it's horrible and harrowing for the person involved, I do find it interesting that the MIB seem to have this ability to drastically affect the psychological mindset of the people they visit. And it almost seems to be, they can instill it, they can amplify this sort of negativity that surrounds the person almost.
All right, back to the calls we go. We'll go to Yellow Springs, Ohio, as promised. It's Marshall's turn. Go ahead, Marshall.
Hi, how you guys doing?
Good, Marshall.
Excellent. Hey, I want to applaud you, Nick. You've done a really good job. I used to be an MIT investigator myself back in the early 90s. But I noticed that you've been exactly, I'm sure the other people involved. But I got some things for you might not be aware of. One, in my investigations, I found out one of the tricks they use to seemingly disappear suddenly, like when you go around a corner. And one of the things that they'll do is they will hide behind a telephone pole. Now, if you notice, a lot of times these guys are fairly skinny, right? Now, there's a way, I actually saw that to witness this. Individual hide behind a telephone pole. I went on the corner, didn't see anybody. I was like, where the hell will this guy go? And all of a sudden the wind blew, and all of a sudden the trench coat flapped out from behind the telephone pole. I'm like, okay. So like, there's all kinds of little tricks so cool that are very physical that you might not think of. Another thing, real quick, is that just a few warnings for might be time travelers. From our research, we actually pinned it down more to just some parallel universe. And speaking in that same vein, are you familiar with a TV show called Fringe? Fringe? Yeah. Right. Well, you notice the observers are actually very much based on MIB, and in particular, they look like the MIB from the Dr. Hawkins case. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes, I have. I think 1976 when he got the visit from this sort of weird-looking MIB.
Right, exactly. These guys are going to be patterned after that. And another thing about the cars, real quick. Have you read Jenny Randall's book on the truth behind the Men in Black?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on page 176 in that book, she talks about how there was a particular case that was investigated by the police when MIB had a Jaguar. It wasn't one of the older cars. It was one of the, it was like a newer model Jaguar. And in fact, it disappeared right in front of them. And that's another reason why the cases I was really interested in were the weird ones. The ones that were obviously weren't ever dated or whatnot.
Marshall, let me ask you for a second here, Marshall. The hiding behind the telephone pole, for example, why would they do that? What were they trying to do?
Well, in other words, this is when they're being pursued. For example, like he gave an example where somebody's going to follow a guy, he got just on a corner, and he danced, they couldn't see him where he went to. That's what they do. When you make these things that just disappear in thin air, if there are split fingers, that's one thing you have to look out for. Try it. I mean, you get a friend that's not very heavy set, and try it, and you'll find out that it actually works. That or ducking behind a car, parked car, in between parked cars. Because what you do is you expect to see someone continuing down the path that they were going, like on a sidewalk or whatever, but you turn a corner. You turn a corner, and all of a sudden, wow, there's nowhere in sight. Like, where did they go? And that's the psychological the routes that they were used sometimes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good tips there, Nick. You never know.
Yeah, I think some of these, as I said, I think particularly the government people, they're well versed in sort of cyber warfare and how to get out of tricky situations and cover their tracks. I think that is, certainly an aspect of the phenomenon that is logical and makes sense. It's I don't think you can answer all the questions, obviously, but I do think, sort of one particular category there might be that, it does offer a logical explanation. These guys are sort of almost like military trained, commando units or whatever.
Catch a men in black, waterboard him, and find out what's going on.
Yeah, that would be great if we could just get hold of one, just even one.
Yeah.
Who are you?
Let's go to Margaret in Bernardino, California. Good morning, Margaret.
Good morning, George and Nick, and this is such a great show. Thank you for taking my call. It seems like the further along we get with technology, the more we find out so little we know. And I have a story that has bothered me for years that happened on Christmas Eve. And it was in 2001, and my dad passed away. And he was a really good guy, went to church every day. And he was, a lot of people knew him. And, after the funeral and after everything had happened, and a few days later, my mom said, talk to Phil across the street. He has a strange story to tell you. And this was a guy who was a retired engineer. And that earlier that day, my dad died at 6 in the evening. Earlier that day, his wife had a brain tumor, and he was waiting for an ambulance to come and get her. And they lived right across the street up an access road. So he was down at the street level waiting for the ambulance, and he told me that he saw these two men in black coats, black hats, walking down the street with a list in their hand. And this was a very small street. This was up in the mountains. So this was a small street. They knew all the neighbors. And it was so out of character. And he saw his name on the list, and he said, "Excuse me, can I help you guys find anyone?" And he looked at them and he said, "No, we're looking for somebody." And they walked right past him and they disappeared right in front of his eyes. And he said he didn't know what it was, but to this day, I always wondered if there was a connection with my dad's passing because it was so unexpected and so immediate. I mean, he was healthy and happy, and then just boom, he was gone.
Well, this is like one of the central aspects of the Men in Black mystery model is the fact that the MIB do turn up and they do vanish. When I say vanish, I don't just mean they seem elusive. There are reports of them just literally vanishing. And I think, how we explain that, I don't know. But I think the sort of the multi-dimensional angle is actually a very interesting one. The idea that there could be multiple portals and doorways to extra dimensions, and things like that, which actually quantum physics is now allowing for, multiple dimensions. And I think the idea that we could have entities that have mastered the ability to sort of just zip in and out of realities and time zones is kind of a logical one to my way of thinking anyway, to explain these sort of weirder aspects of the mystery.
Next up, Whidbey Island, Washington, Paul Stern. Paul, good morning.
Hi, George and Nick. I'm so glad I stayed up for this one. I have a very quick question. I'm fascinated by the anecdotal material regarding animals' interactions and the paranormal. So, Nick, in all your research, have you ever found any people who have told you their pets have had any strange reactions to or interactions with these MIB visits? Thank you.
That's actually a very good question because, I've got a couple of cases in the book. One involved a doctor named Herbert Hopkins, who in 1976 had a really weird MIB encounter, sort of very bone-chilling one almost, one of the very creepy white character. And Hopkins said that his dog, which was like a big German Shepherd, just turned tail, howled, and just raced off to one of the cupboards in the house when the MIB was invited in. And it was sort of pretty clear from the story that the dog recognized there was something very strange about this character, not just a regular human being in a black suit. The dog just basically stayed in the cupboard shaking until the MIB had gone. And there are a number of stories like that where the MIB don't express sort of hostility towards the animal, but the animal either shows hostility or is just downright petrified and just wants to get away from the area. So they're clearly, I think, picking up on something. If it's just some sort of negative vibe, or what it is, I don't know. But dogs really seem to recognize that there's something not right about the MIB.
All right, good. Bob in Atlanta, it's your turn. Go ahead, Bob. Thank you.
Hey, George, thanks very much. You got a great show. Nick, I love your work, too. I wanted to talk to you about these men in black. I'm with you. I believe that some of them may be, something that we just can't get a grasp of. Because like you said at the beginning of the show, some of the people, they feel like, they get some kind of uneasy, creepy feeling when these things show up. And then I've heard the governor, Jesse Ventura, he had a show where he was trying to expose government conspiracies. And he said that he thought he had been followed by some men in black. And, he's a very prominent person. So anyway, it's hard to say what these things really are. I wanted to ask you about your book, Final Event. That was an outstanding book about the government think tank on UFOs and how they pretty much came to the conclusion they were demonic. And that's what I've always thought all this stuff was. It's something to do with, demons. I was just wondering, with all the research that you've done on it, you haven't came to that conclusion yourself?
Well, I think it's difficult, when we're sort of trying to determine what UFOs are, because, when we talk about demons, it's the idea that they're literal demons from hell or wherever, is, I guess, a construct of Christianity. Other religions, talk about jinns. Islam talks about the jinn, which is sort of can be a benevolent or malevolent entity. So in other words, I think, a lot of how we define some of these sort of quasi-supernatural entities or whatever is dependent upon which belief system we're talking about. My personal conclusion is that I'm inclined to go down the sort of more multi-dimensional path rather than just literally extraterrestrial. I think I've come more and more over perhaps the last 10 years or so to the idea that the UFO phenomenon is sort of extra-dimensional and they sort of coexist with us rather than necessarily, somebody from point A in this particular star system coming here. But I will admit, that some of the stories, they do have parallels with ancient folklore, mythology, religion, to where there's clearly some connection going on. But I try not to get caught up too much in belief systems to explain the nature of the phenomenon beyond the fact that I know for sure that something's interacting.
And other countries are getting the same kind of reports on MIBs. Yeah. All right, Nick, I want to thank you for being on the program. And again, marvelous work with this one, The Real Men in
Oh, I
Black. Nick,
appreciate that, George. Thank you. And if people are interested, I'm actually speaking at the Conscious Life Expo the first weekend in October in Los
okay,
Angeles.
I'll see you there, by the way. I'll see
All right,
you there.
great.
So I look forward to seeing you. Nick Redfern, always a great guest and a superb researcher in the field of ufology